Welcome to this account of one of the most troubling cases ever recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we start, I invite you to share in the comments where you're watching from and the precise time you're hearing this narration. We're curious to know which locations and what hours of the day or night these documented accounts manage to reach. Back in the winter of 1912, a brief notice regarding a family disturbance appeared in the Springfield Republican newspaper, originating from deep within the Ozark Mountains in Tenney County. Spanning barely 3 paragraphs, the piece mentioned that local authorities had been summoned to probe the disappearance of a woman by the name of Eliza Whitlock from her secluded homestead near the White River. According to the newspaper, her husband, Thomas Whitlock, maintained that she had departed willingly following a domestic quarrel. The article wrapped up by mentioning that at that time, no further investigation was deemed necessary. What went unmentioned by the newspaper was that this small report would mark the beginning of what would become one of the most disturbing stories in Ozark history, a case destined to stay largely undocumented for many decades. Situated on roughly 40 acres of rocky hillside, the Whitlock property was located near the modest settlement of Walnut Shade, approximately 15 miles south of Forsyth, the seat of Tenney County. The homestead comprised a 2-story timber frame house, a small barn, and various outbuildings. According to 1908 county records, Thomas Whitlock had bought the property after relocating from Springfield, where he had been employed as a clerk at Heer's department store. These same records characterized Thomas as a man with a quiet nature and specific habits. His wife, Eliza, formerly Eliza Crawford, had taught school in Christian County prior to their marriage in 1905. The couple had 2 children, Edward, age 6 in 1912, and Mary, age 4. As neighbors later recalled, the Whitlocks kept to themselves and seldom engaged in community activities. While Thomas would occasionally venture into Forsyth or Branson for supplies, after their first year of residence Eliza was hardly ever seen beyond the property boundaries. Such isolation was hardly unusual for the area, where homesteads could lie miles apart, separated by thick oak and pine forests, limestone bluffs, and deep hollows. The Ozarks had long served as a destination for people wishing to vanish, whether from legal troubles, financial obligations, or society in general. Based on recollections from Joseph Miller, whose family owned the adjacent property to the east, the Whitlocks appeared reasonably content during their first few years on the homestead. When interviewed in 1952 by a Missouri Historical Society researcher, Miller remembered that Thomas was meticulous about his land boundaries and mostly kept to himself, though he would offer a nod of greeting when our paths happened to cross. As for the missus, she was even more withdrawn, but the children came across as healthy and adequately dressed. Miller also observed that around the fall of 1911, roughly 6 months before Eliza vanished, Thomas started making improvements to the property, digging what seemed to be a new root cellar behind the house and reinforcing the doors with extra locks. The final confirmed sighting of Eliza Whitlock by anyone outside her immediate family took place in November 1911, when Harriet Bowman, a midwife from Walnut Shade, visited the homestead after receiving word that Eliza was unwell. In a statement given to the Tenney County Sheriff in April 1912, Bowman recounted finding Eliza looking pale and distant, with a nervous disposition, though no physical ailment was apparent. According to Bowman, the house was unusually cold despite the lit fireplace, and Thomas remained present throughout her visit, answering most of the questions directed at his wife. When Bowman proposed that Eliza might gain from a visit to the doctor in Forsyth, Thomas reportedly replied that such an expense was beyond the family's means and that rest would restore his wife's health. County records reveal that during the autumn of 1911, Thomas Whitlock had been making steady withdrawals from the family's modest savings at the Tenney County Bank. According to ledgers preserved in the county archives, nearly half the family savings were withdrawn by Thomas between September and December of that year. The bank manager, Harold Winters, later recalled Thomas explaining these withdrawals as necessary for home improvements and winter preparations. Winters noted that such spending wasn't unusual for homesteaders getting ready for an Ozark winter, though the amount did seem excessive for a family with the Whitlocks' resources. The winter spanning 1911 to 1912 proved especially brutal in the Ozarks. Heavy snowfall in December and January left many remote homesteads cut off for weeks on end, and it wasn't uncommon for families to have no outside contact until early spring. Weather records from the Springfield Weather Bureau show that temperatures in February 1912 dropped to near 0 degrees Fahrenheit on multiple occasions, with several inches of snow persisting until mid-March. The isolation brought on by these conditions meant that unusual activities could go undetected by neighbors for lengthy periods. It was during this time of seclusion, sometime between late February and early March 1912, that Eliza Whitlock supposedly left her family. The precise date of her disappearance was never firmly determined. Thomas Whitlock first mentioned his wife's absence to Joseph Miller in late March when Miller encountered him on the road to Forsyth. According to Miller's 1952 account, Thomas stated simply that the missus had gone away, offering no elaboration. Given his neighbor's private nature, Miller didn't press for more details. Store ledgers from the general store in Forsyth indicate that Thomas Whitlock's buying habits shifted noticeably in early March 1912. On March 4, he purchased an unusually large quantity of preserved foods, coffee, and lamp oil, enough to sustain a household for several weeks without needing another trip to town. Store owner Jeremiah Collins noted in his personal journal, discovered among his papers after his 1938 death, that Thomas seemed agitated and disinclined to engage in the usual pleasantries during this visit. Collins wrote that when he asked after Mrs. Whitlock's health, Thomas responded curtly that she was not his concern at present. The matter might have stayed entirely private had Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, not intervened. A Springfield resident, Catherine hadn't heard from Eliza since the previous autumn. According to correspondence kept in the Tenney County Historical Society archives, she wrote to the Walnut Shade postmaster in early April 1912 inquiring about her sister's welfare. Upon learning from the postmaster that Eliza had reportedly left her family, Catherine traveled to Tenney County and requested that Sheriff James Harmon investigate the disappearance. Catherine Crawford's personal journal, donated to the Missouri State Archives by her granddaughter in 1961, offers insight into her worries regarding her sister's circumstances. In an entry dated April 10, 1912, Catherine wrote, "I cannot believe that Eliza would leave her children willingly." Since her marriage to Thomas, her letters had grown increasingly infrequent and guarded, but her devotion to Edward and Mary was evident in every word she wrote about them. "Something is terribly wrong, and I fear what I might discover in Tenney County." Sheriff Harmon's official report from April 18, 1912 documents his visit to the Whitlock homestead. He reported finding the property in good order, with Thomas and both children present. The children appeared adequately fed and clothed, though Harmon noted that both were unusually quiet during his visit. Thomas maintained that Eliza had left voluntarily after expressing dissatisfaction with their isolated life, taking only a small bag with personal items. He claimed ignorance of her destination, but suggested she might have returned to her family in Springfield, despite Catherine's insistence that her sister hadn't contacted any relatives. Harmon's report includes a brief description of his inspection of the house, which showed no signs of disturbance or struggle. He observed that Eliza's clothing and personal effects seemed missing from the bedroom drawers, supporting Thomas's claim that she had packed before departing. The sheriff concluded that insufficient evidence of foul play existed and that as an adult, Eliza had the right to leave her family if she chose. With Catherine Crawford's reluctant acceptance of this conclusion, the official investigation ended. What Harmon's report omitted, but what later emerged from his personal papers discovered after his 1931 death, was that he had noted several concerning details during his visit to the Whitlock property. In a personal notebook separate from his official records, Harmon wrote, "Whitlock was too composed for a man recently abandoned." The children watched their father's face before answering any question, no matter how innocuous. The boy began to speak about his mother, but stopped abruptly when Thomas cleared his throat. Most troubling was the fresh-turned earth behind the house, which Whitlock claimed was a garden plot, though it was an odd time for planting and shaped more like a trench than a garden bed. Harmon's private note suggests he harbored suspicions about Thomas Whitlock, but lacked sufficient evidence to pursue them further. The sheriff wrote, "Without a body or a witness, there is no crime to investigate." Mrs. Crawford's concerns, while understandable, do not constitute proof. In these hills, family matters are generally considered private, and the county lacks resources for extended investigations based on mere suspicion. This reluctance to intervene without concrete evidence mirrored the limited law enforcement capabilities and cultural attitudes prevalent in rural Missouri during the early 20th century. Following her meeting with Sheriff Harmon, Catherine Crawford returned to Springfield, but her concerns about her sister's fate remained. According to her journal, she attempted to maintain contact with her niece and nephew by sending letters and small gifts, but received only brief formal acknowledgments from Thomas. In June 1912, she traveled once more to Tenney County, hoping to visit the children, but was turned away by Thomas, who informed her that her presence was disruptive to the household routine. Catherine's final journal entry regarding the matter, dated July 3, 1912, reads, "I fear I have failed Eliza. Without proof or legal standing, I cannot force my way into Thomas's home or remove the children. I can only pray that if Eliza is alive somewhere, she will find her way back to them. Or at least to me." For several years, the disappearance of Eliza Whitlock remained a private matter known only to her immediate family and a few locals. Thomas continued operating the homestead, raising his children with occasional assistance from a local woman, Martha Jenkins, who came to help with household tasks several times a week. Jenkins, who began working at the Whitlock home in the summer of 1912, later told a neighbor that Thomas had instructed her never to discuss Eliza with the children and to tell them if they asked that their mother would return when she was better. Jenkins was interviewed briefly by Sheriff Masterson during the 1952 investigation. By then an elderly woman residing in a Branson nursing home, she recalled several unusual aspects of her employment at the Whitlock home. According to the interview transcript preserved in the county archives, Jenkins stated that Thomas had established strict rules about certain areas of the property that were to be avoided. He would not allow anyone near the root cellar he had built, she said. Once when young Mary wandered toward it, Thomas grabbed her so roughly that she cried out. He later apologized, saying there were dangerous tools stored there that might harm the children. Jenkins also reported that Thomas frequently suffered from insomnia and would pace the house at night. On several occasions, she arrived in the morning to find him sitting at the kitchen table, apparently having been awake all night, muttering about keeping watch and maintaining the barriers. Jenkins admitted that she found these behaviors concerning, but attributed them to the stress of raising two children alone. Like many in the community, she was reluctant to interfere in what she considered private family matters. Edward and Mary Whitlock attended the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade beginning in 1913. Their teacher, Abigail Thornton, noted in her personal diary that both children were abnormally withdrawn and that Edward in particular exhibited a worrying tendency toward prolonged silences. Thornton recorded an incident in October 1913 when a female visitor to the school attempted to engage Mary in conversation about her mother. According to Thornton, Mary became visibly distressed, and later that day, Thomas Whitlock arrived at the school, removed both children, and kept them home for nearly 2 weeks. Thornton's diary, which remained in private hands until being donated to the Tenney County Historical Society in 1965, contains several other observations about the Whitlock children. She noted that Edward often arrived at school with dark circles under his eyes, explaining that the noises kept him awake at night. When asked what noises he meant, the boy refused to elaborate. Mary, though younger, seemed to adapt better to school life, but displayed what Thornton described as an unusual preoccupation with burial. The teacher recorded finding a series of drawings in Mary's desk depicting what appeared to be a figure lying underground with flowers growing above. In the spring of 1914, according to Thornton's diary, Edward Whitlock's behavior became increasingly concerning. He began having what the teacher described as episodes, periods when he would become unresponsive, staring fixedly at nothing. Following one such episode, during which Edward had whispered repeatedly, "She's still digging," Thornton attempted to discuss the boy's welfare with Thomas. Her diary entry for April 12, 1914 reads, "Mr. Whitlock received my concerns with cold anger. He informed me that his son's education was his business, and my observations were unwelcome. I fear for these children, but what can I do? Mr. Whitlock has threatened to remove them from school permanently if I pursue the matter." The Whitlock family continued their isolated existence until 1917 when Thomas abruptly sold the homestead and moved with the children to Kansas City. County records indicate that the property was sold to James Harker, a cattle rancher from Arkansas, for significantly less than its assessed value. Harker later commented to neighbors that Thomas seemed eager to conclude the sale quickly and had accepted the first offer presented. The timing of the Whitlock family's departure coincided with increased scrutiny from local authorities. Records from the Tenney County School Board discovered during the 1952 investigation revealed that Abigail Thornton had finally reported her concerns about the Whitlock children to the county superintendent in March 1917. The superintendent had subsequently initiated an inquiry, sending a letter to Thomas requesting a meeting to discuss the children's welfare. According to post office records, this letter was delivered on April 3, 1917. Thomas listed the property for sale the following day and had completed the transaction by the end of the month. James Harker, who purchased the Whitlock property, made several modifications to the homestead, including demolishing what remained of the root cellar behind the house. In a statement given to investigators in 1952, Harker's son, William, recalled that his father had described the cellar as peculiar, deeper than necessary for storing produce, and divided into sections by interior walls. William Harker stated that his father had found several unusual items during the demolition, including a woman's hairbrush with dark hairs still entangled in the bristles, buried approximately 2 feet below the cellar floor. According to William, his father had thought little of the discovery at the time, assuming it was merely discarded household debris. The Harker family maintained ownership of the former Whitlock property until 1933, when economic hardship forced them to sell during the Great Depression. The homestead passed through several owners over the next 2 decades, gradually falling into disrepair as the original buildings aged and newer residents focused on other areas of the property. By 1950, the house was largely abandoned, with local teenagers occasionally using it as a meeting place, giving rise to rumors that the property was haunted by a crying woman who could sometimes be heard on quiet nights. For the next several decades, the story of Eliza Whitlock's disappearance faded from local memory. The family's departure from the area, combined with the disruption of World War I and the subsequent influenza epidemic, pushed the unresolved matter into obscurity. It might have remained there permanently had it not been for a discovery made in 1952 when the former Whitlock property, by then abandoned and overgrown, was purchased by Walter and Ruth Simmons, a couple from St. Louis planning to establish a hunting lodge. According to a report filed with the Tenney County Sheriff's Department on June 12, 1952, the Simmons were clearing brush behind the deteriorating house when they uncovered what appeared to be the collapsed entrance to an old root cellar or storage space. Upon closer inspection, they discovered a small leather-bound book wedged between 2 of the limestone blocks that had formed the cellar's foundation. The book, severely damaged by moisture and time, was identified as a personal diary belonging to Eliza Whitlock, with entries dating from January 1910 to February 1912. Ruth Simmons, who made the initial discovery of the diary, later recalled her first impression of the book in an interview with the Springfield News Leader. The pages were stuck together, and much of the ink had run, but you could still make out the handwriting in places. What struck me immediately was the change in the writer's penmanship over time. The early entries were neat and controlled, while the later ones became increasingly erratic, as if written by someone in a state of agitation or fear. The discovery of the diary prompted a renewed investigation by Sheriff William Masterson. The contents of the diary, partially legible despite the damage, revealed a disturbing account of the final years of Eliza Whitlock's life. The entries, initially documenting mundane aspects of rural life, gradually shifted to express Eliza's increasing anxiety about her husband's behavior. In an entry dated August 14, 1911, she wrote, "He watches constantly, says the house is not secure enough. Speaks of dangers I cannot see. When I suggested visiting my sister, his face changed in a way I cannot describe." Another entry dated October 3, 1911 stated, "The children are forbidden to wander beyond the yard now. He has nailed shut the window in our bedroom. Says it is to keep out the cold. But the first frost has not even come." The diary's most concerning entries began in November 1911, coinciding with Harriet Bowman's visit. Eliza wrote, "The midwife came today. I wanted to speak freely, but could not with him standing there listening to every word. When she left, he said no one else would be permitted to enter our house. He says they bring contamination from town." In December, she recorded, "The new room beneath the house is nearly completed. He works on it when he thinks I am asleep. He speaks of it as a sanctuary, but it feels more like a tomb." A particularly disturbing entry dated January 8, 1912 reads, "I found Edward this morning standing at the entrance to the cellar, staring at the door. When I asked what he was doing, he said, 'Father says we'll all sleep there soon when the time comes.'" When I questioned him about this, he became enraged, accusing me of turning the children against him. He did not leave my side for the remainder of the day. As January progressed, Eliza's entries became shorter and more fragmented. On January 23rd, she wrote, "He gives me a tonic he prepares each evening. It leaves me groggy and confused the next day. I began pouring it into my potted plant when he isn't looking. The plant died within days." Another entry dated February 2nd simply states, "I must get the children away from here." But how? The snow is deep and we are miles from town. He has hidden my boots and coat. He says it is to prevent me from falling ill, but I know the truth. The final readable entry dated February 17, 1912, contained just 3 lines, "He found these pages tonight." His rage was terrible. "The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again." Based on the diary's contents, Sheriff Masterson ordered an excavation of the area where the root cellar had been located. On June 18, 1952, investigators uncovered human remains, later identified through dental records as those of Eliza Whitlock. Medical examination determined that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull prior to burial. The position of the remains suggested she had been placed face down in a shallow grave with her hands bound behind her back with wire. Dr. Lawrence Wilson, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy on Eliza's remains, noted several additional details in his report. Wilson determined that Eliza had been approximately 32 years old at the time of death, consistent with her known age. He also found evidence of a previous fracture to her left wrist that had healed sometime before her death, an injury not mentioned in any known records. Most significantly, Wilson identified traces of a sedative compound in the preserved tissue samples, suggesting that Eliza may have been drugged prior to her death. This finding corroborated her diary entries about the tonic Thomas had insisted she consume. Following the discovery, authorities attempted to locate Thomas Whitlock and his children, but the investigation revealed that Thomas had died in a Kansas City hospital in 1931 from complications related to pneumonia. Edward Whitlock had been killed in action during World War II in 1944. Only Mary Whitlock, by then Mary Coleman, was still living, residing in Omaha, Nebraska, with her husband and 3 children. Records from the Kansas City Public Library examined during the investigation provided some information about the Whitlock family's life after leaving Tenney County. City directories showed that Thomas had worked as a night watchman at a warehouse from 1917 until 1928, when health problems forced him to retire. Edward had attended school through the 8th grade before taking a job at the same warehouse. Neighbors from the period, tracked down by investigators, described Thomas as a strict father who kept to himself but was not notably unusual in his behavior. One former neighbor, Estelle Parker, recalled that Thomas never spoke of his late wife and became agitated if anyone inquired about the children's mother. Mary Whitlock had married Richard Coleman, an insurance salesman, in 1929 and moved to Omaha shortly thereafter. According to marriage records, she had listed her mother as deceased on the application, though no death certificate for Eliza existed at that time. This suggested that either Thomas had told his daughter that her mother had died, or Mary herself had chosen to represent her absent mother this way. When contacted by Missouri authorities in July 1952, Mary Coleman claimed to have no recollection of the events surrounding her mother's disappearance. She stated that her father had always told her that her mother had abandoned the family and she had no reason to question this account. However, Coleman's husband later contacted investigators privately, reporting that his wife suffered from recurring nightmares about a woman calling from beneath the floorboards and had always exhibited an extreme fear of enclosed spaces. Richard Coleman provided investigators with additional information about his wife's psychological state. In a letter preserved in the case file, he wrote, "Mary has suffered from what doctors now call anxiety attacks throughout our marriage. These episodes are often triggered by certain sounds, particularly the sound of digging or scraping, or by the sight of certain objects, including gardening tools and root cellars. For years, she has refused to enter our basement or any underground space. When I asked about the origin of these fears, she would become distant and change the subject." The investigation revealed additional details through interviews with former residents of Tenney County who had known the Whitlock family. Clara Jensen, who had been a young girl living near Walnut Shade in 1912, recalled that her father had once encountered Thomas Whitlock in Forsyth purchasing an unusual amount of quicklime from the hardware store. When questioned about the purchase, Thomas had explained it was for preserving the root cellar walls against moisture. Jensen also remembered hearing her parents discuss strange sounds coming from the direction of the Whitlock property late at night during that winter, sounds her father had attributed to wild animals or the wind in the hollow. Jensen's brother Harold provided a written statement describing an encounter he had with Edward Whitlock in the spring of 1912. According to this statement, Harold had encountered Edward near the property line separating their family's lands. The Whitlock boy had appeared distressed and asked Harold if people could hear things through the ground. When Harold asked what he meant, Edward had replied, "Father says no one can hear anything through the ground once it's packed down tight, but I think I can still hear her sometimes." Before Harold could inquire further, Thomas Whitlock had appeared, calling his son home. Harold had mentioned the strange conversation to his parents, but they had dismissed it as childish imagination. Further research into Thomas Whitlock's background uncovered a possible explanation for his increasingly paranoid behavior in the months preceding Eliza's disappearance. Records from the State Lunatic Asylum in Nevada, Missouri, now known as the Nevada State Hospital, revealed that Thomas's father, William Whitlock, had been committed to the institution in 1890 after exhibiting violent paranoid delusions. The elder Whitlock had reportedly become convinced that his wife was conspiring against him with neighbors and had attempted to imprison her in their home. Hospital records indicated that William Whitlock died in the asylum in 1902, with notes describing a hereditary tendency toward paranoid ideation. The asylum records also contained a letter from Thomas's mother, Sarah Whitlock, written to the hospital director in 1895. In this letter, she expressed concern about her son's nervous disposition and inquired whether her husband's condition might be passed to their children. The director's response, also preserved in the file, assured Sarah that mental aberrations are not necessarily inherited, but advised that Thomas should be guided toward occupations that avoid excessive stress or isolation, suggesting that some familial predisposition toward mental illness was recognized even then. In October 1952, Professor Alan Matthews, a historian researching Ozark folklore at the University of Missouri, visited the former Whitlock property at the invitation of the new owners. Matthews documented the layout of the homestead and the location where Eliza's remains had been found. His notes, preserved in the university archives, described the isolated nature of the property. The homestead sits in a narrow valley surrounded on three sides by steep wooded slopes. Even at midday, parts of the yard remain in shadow. The nearest neighbor's house, though less than a mile away as the crow flies, is invisible from the Whitlock property due to the intervening terrain. A person could scream here without being heard beyond these hills. Matthews also recorded local beliefs that had developed around the property in the years following the Whitlock's departure. Several residents of Walnut Shade reported avoiding the area, claiming that travelers passing the abandoned homestead at night sometimes heard a woman weeping or the sound of digging. Matthews noted that such stories were typical of many abandoned properties in the Ozarks, but suggested that in this case they might have originated from actual sounds heard by passers-by during the winter of 1911 to 1912. In his field journal, Matthews wrote, "The acoustic properties of this valley are unusual. Standing at the former site of the root cellar, I conducted a simple experiment, dropping stones into the remaining depression and noting how the sound carried. Even a small impact produces an echo that reverberates between the limestone bluffs. It occurs to me that if someone were digging in this location at night, when ambient noise is reduced, the sound might indeed travel considerable distances, creating the impression of ghostly activity to those unfamiliar with the terrain." The case of Eliza Whitlock was officially closed in December 1952, with her death ruled a homicide attributed to Thomas Whitlock. Her remains were interred in the Springfield Cemetery where her parents and sister were buried. The story received brief attention in regional newspapers, but was quickly overshadowed by larger national events. The Tenney County Historical Society maintains a small file on the case, including copies of the original sheriff's reports, excerpts from Eliza's diary, and newspaper clippings related to the 1952 discovery. Among these materials is a transcript of an interview conducted with Richard Anderson, who had been a deputy sheriff under James Harmon in 1912. Anderson, in his late 70s at the time of the 1952 investigation, recalled that Sheriff Harmon had remained troubled by the Whitlock case long after the official investigation ended. According to Anderson, Harmon had mentioned the case on several occasions over the years, once remarking that, "Sometimes the law's limitations mean that justice must wait." Anderson believed that Harmon had suspected foul play but lacked the evidence and resources to pursue the case further. In 1968, the last significant development in the Whitlock case occurred when Mary Coleman's oldest son, Robert, contacted the Tenney County Historical Society requesting information about his grandparents. According to correspondence in the Society's archives, Robert had recently discovered his mother's collection of childhood drawings hidden in their attic after her death from cancer earlier that year. The drawings, created when Mary was between 5 and 8 years old, depicted a recurring scene, a small female figure beneath what appeared to be floorboards or ground, with stick figures standing above. One drawing, labeled in a child's handwriting with the words, "Mama sleeping," showed a similar scene with what appeared to be a man digging. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, a psychologist who examined the drawings at the request of the Historical Society, provided a written analysis that is included in the case file. Mitchell noted that the drawings displayed several characteristics typical of children who have experienced trauma, including repetition of disturbing themes, use of heavy pressure when drawing certain elements, particularly the lines representing the ground or floor, and the placement of figures in constrained or buried positions. Mitchell concluded, "These drawings strongly suggest that the child who created them witnessed or was aware of a deeply disturbing event involving the burial of a female figure, presumably her mother." The consistency of the imagery across multiple drawings indicates that this was not a momentary fantasy, but a persistent memory or preoccupation. Robert Coleman visited the former Whitlock property in the summer of 1968, by which time the original house had been demolished and replaced with the hunting lodge. In a letter to the Historical Society following his visit, he wrote, "Standing on that ground, I felt a profound sense of sorrow, not just for the grandmother I never knew, but for my mother, who carried this buried truth her entire life. Some secrets refuse to remain hidden, no matter how deeply they are buried." Coleman went on to describe his mother as a loving parent, but always somehow distant, as if part of her remained locked in that valley in the Ozarks. He revealed that Mary had refused to discuss her childhood and had reacted with unusual anxiety when her children asked about their maternal grandparents. "Now I understand why," Coleman wrote. "She was protecting us from a truth she herself could not fully face, that her father, the men who raised her, had murdered her mother and forced her to become complicit in a lifetime of silence." The Whitlock case exemplifies a phenomenon that criminologists would later identify in numerous rural communities, the way in which isolation and privacy can enable domestic violence to escalate without intervention. In the early 20th century Ozarks, where homesteads were separated by difficult terrain and cultural norms discouraged interference in family matters, a woman like Eliza Whitlock had few options for escape once her husband's mental state deteriorated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and winter weather made travel nearly impossible. Even when concerns were raised, as by the midwife Harriet Bowman or teacher Abigail Thornton, the limited resources and jurisdiction of local authorities meant that effective intervention was unlikely. Professor Matthews, in a paper published in the Journal of Ozark Studies in 1954, used the Whitlock case to illustrate broader patterns in rural crime and community response. He noted that Thomas Whitlock's status as the male head of household granted him nearly absolute authority over his family in the eyes of the community. Neighbors who might have noticed warning signs were reluctant to intervene, adhering to the principle that a man's home is his castle. Matthews argued that this combination of physical isolation and cultural insulation created conditions in which family violence could occur with minimal risk of discovery or consequence. The psychological impact on the Whitlock children represents another dimension of the case that has drawn scholarly attention. Dr. Mitchell, in her analysis of Mary's drawings, suggested that the young girl had developed a complex coping mechanism to deal with the trauma she had witnessed. Rather than facing the unbearable reality of her father's actions, Mitchell wrote, Mary appears to have compartmentalized the experience, creating a psychological barrier between her conscious awareness and the truth she knew at some level. This fragmentation of memory is a known response to childhood trauma, allowing the individual to function, but at the cost of complete psychological integration. Today, the former Whitlock property is part of a larger recreational area. Few visitors know the history of that particular piece of land or the tragic events that occurred there. The limestone bluffs still cast long shadows across the valley, and at dusk, When the wind moves through the hollow, some say it carries echoes of the past, sounds that might be mistaken for a woman's distant voice calling from somewhere beneath the ground. What makes the case of Eliza Whitlock particularly disturbing is not just the manner of her death, but the silent complicity that allowed her disappearance to go uninvestigated for so long. In the isolated communities of the early 20th century Ozarks, privacy was highly valued and interfering in family matters was generally avoided. This cultural tendency toward non-intervention created an environment where someone could effectively vanish with minimal questioning. The diary found in 1952 provides our only window into Eliza's experience during those final months, her growing fear as her husband's mental state deteriorated, her concern for her children's safety, and her increasing isolation from the outside world. The entries suggest a woman who recognized her danger but found herself trapped by both physical circumstances and social conventions that offered little protection to wives and mothers. Perhaps most haunting is the legacy of silence that continued long after Eliza's death. Her children, particularly Mary, seem to have buried their memories along with their mother, creating psychological barriers that protected them from confronting the truth. When Mary's drawings were discovered after her death, they revealed that some part of her had always known what happened, that the truth had found expression in her art, even as it remained unspoken in her life. Local historian Margaret Branson, who has studied the Whitlock case extensively, observed in a 2012 article marking the centennial of Eliza's disappearance, what happened in that isolated valley was not simply the murder of a woman by her mentally ill husband, but the murder of truth itself. Thomas Whitlock buried his wife twice, first in the ground behind their home, and then in a narrative that erased her existence and replaced it with abandonment. The children, too young to fully understand but old enough to know something was terribly wrong, were forced to participate in this fiction, carrying the weight of an unacknowledged truth throughout their lives. The case reminds us that the most profound horrors often occur not in dramatic moments of violence, but in the slow erosion of safety, in the gradual transformation of home into prison, and in the terrible silence that can descend when those who should protect us become our greatest threat. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound travels strangely and darkness comes early, Eliza Whitlock's story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary humans whose minds have turned against them and against those they once loved. For those who study such cases, the Whitlock tragedy exemplifies how isolation can magnify mental illness, how cultural norms can enable abuse, and how the truth, no matter how carefully buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. In the decades since Eliza's remains were discovered, forensic psychology has developed tools that might have identified Thomas Whitlock's deteriorating mental state before it led to violence, and laws have changed to offer greater protection to potential victims. Yet similar stories continue to unfold in isolated places where privacy can still serve as a shield for the unthinkable. The limestone soil of the Ozarks eventually revealed what Thomas Whitlock tried to hide. But for 40 years, Eliza lay forgotten in her unmarked grave, her fate unknown to all but the men who put her there and perhaps the children who carried the burden of that knowledge in their nightmares and their silence. In that silence lies the true horror of the Whitlock case, a silence that spoke volumes to those willing to listen. Dr. Samuel Hirsch, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case records in 1960 for an article in the American Journal of Psychiatry, proposed that Thomas Whitlock likely suffered from what would now be classified as paranoid schizophrenia, similar to his father's condition. Hirsch noted that the onset of Thomas's symptoms appeared to follow the classic pattern of the disorder, with initial manifestations in his late 20s or early 30s gradually increasing in severity. The progressive nature of his paranoia, beginning with general suspicion of neighbors, escalating to fears about the security of his home, and culminating in the belief that his wife was somehow contaminated or dangerous, aligns with documented patterns of untreated psychosis. What distinguishes the Whitlock case from many similar tragedies, Hirsch argued, was the extended period during which Thomas maintained a facade of normalcy after eliminating the perceived threat. Most familicide cases end with the perpetrator's suicide or immediate apprehension, Hirsch wrote. Whitlock's ability to create and sustain an alternative narrative, that his wife had abandoned the family, and to function in society for nearly 2 decades afterward suggests a complicated relationship between his delusions and his awareness of social norms. He knew enough to hide his actions and create a plausible cover story, indicating that some part of him recognized that what he had done would be condemned by others. The children's response to the trauma they witnessed or intuited has been of particular interest to psychologists studying the case. Edward Whitlock's school records, recovered during the 1952 investigation, show a pattern of declining academic performance and increasing behavioral problems following his mother's disappearance. His teacher noted instances of what would now be recognized as dissociative episodes, periods when he became unresponsive or appeared to be listening to sounds others could not hear. These symptoms suggest that Edward may have developed what modern clinicians would classify as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mary Whitlock's response differed from her brother's in significant ways. While Edward exhibited more obvious signs of distress, Mary appeared to adapt more readily to their changed circumstances. Dr. Mitchell suggested that Mary's younger age at the time of the trauma might have made it easier for her to compartmentalize her experiences. Children of 3 to 4 years old are still developing their understanding of permanence and causality, Mitchell wrote in her analysis. Mary may have been better able to accept the narrative her father presented because her cognitive framework was still forming. However, as her drawings reveal, the truth remained present in her unconscious mind, emerging through her artwork in ways she could not verbally express. The long-term impact of childhood trauma is further evidenced by Mary's adult life. According to her husband's statements to investigators, she exhibited several characteristics common to adult survivors of childhood trauma: chronic anxiety, specific phobias related to the traumatic event, particularly her fear of enclosed spaces and an aversion to digging sounds, and emotional detachment. Richard Coleman described his wife as loving but somehow absent, as if a part of her remained elsewhere. This splitting of consciousness,